A spat between the U.S. and Israel, the House sues the President, Bill Clinton on Osama bin Laden, and the CIA apologizes to the Senate. I'm John Romero, and this is The Square Circle. Hello, and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, John Romero. Joining us today are Nick Barnea, formerly of the Terry McAuliffe campaign, Scott Greer of the Daily Caller, Nick Morphus of Liberty Minds, and communications consultant Don Owens. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
First up today is the tension that arose this week between Israel and U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. Kerry tried to broker a ceasefire, but the Israeli Security Cabinet rejected his plan unanimously. Israeli columnist Nahum Barnea wrote that Kerry is, quote, a friend of Israel, but with friends like these, sometimes it's better to negotiate with your enemies. The State Department later shot back with criticism of its own. Scott Greer, is Israeli criticism of Kerry warranted? And what does this episode portend for future U.S. Israeli relations?
Well, the criticism comes from a point that they feel that John Kerry is not vouching for their interests. The deal he was trying to make was conceded too much to Hamas, and even Hamas rejected it, while Egypt's Saudi Arabia and Jordan, which are surprisingly supporting Israel in this conflict because they hate Hamas far more than they have any problems with Israel. He decided not to meet with them and meet with Qatar and Turkey and Hamas officials instead of meeting with them and working out a plan with them. So a lot of Israelis are frustrated with how John Kerry's been handling this process, and of course it was scuttled, and today there's been more tension. So I think it is warranted, but I don't think it's going to have any major future implications for U.S. Israeli relations. I think Israel knows that we're their best ally we have, especially with all the riots going on in Europe, UN condemning their actions in Gaza, while U.S. is still saying that Israel has a right to defend itself. So I don't see any major implications coming from this recent spat.
We'll keep it on this side of the table. Nick, your thoughts?
Well, lately I've been following a lot of the Israel-Gaza issues, and what I worry about is our tendency to always jump on Israel's side no matter what happens. This quote of theirs on John Kerry to me is irrelevant. We really shouldn't even be getting involved in the entire spat in the first place. This whole issue with Israel is between Israel and the Palestinians, not between us. And by us constantly interjecting, whether it be brokering a peace deal, supporting one side or the other, which we are always on the side of Israel no matter what happens, whether they bomb a UN camp or anything in Palestine. This issue shouldn't even be between a spat of John Kerry and the Israelis. It should just be the Israelis and Gaza. Let them work it out rather than us getting involved every 5 seconds something happens over there.
Don.
That's an interesting perspective. I didn't think I'd agree with Nick so early in the evening, but he's got a point. John Kerry has an incredibly difficult job. It's seemingly he's negotiating with two sides who don't want to not kill each other. And that makes it more difficult. I made this point when I was on the show 2 weeks ago. Irrespective of the Palestinian people actually getting caught in between these two military entities, there does come a question when you look at some of the other players in this, countries in the Middle East, like Qatar, like Egypt, Saudi Arabia possibly. These are all very wealthy, oil-rich countries. And when you look at the Arab panacea people across the Middle East, you have to ask yourself, the Palestinian people have traditionally been used as pawns in the war against conflict with Israel. Why is that? If Palestinians could truly get the support of these larger, richer Arab countries, i.e., allow some of these countries to come in and negotiate their own peace with the Israelis, but you don't see that. Instead, we have our Secretary of State, in this case John Kerry, flying across the world and having to dip back into the Middle East with Israel and Palestine. And I don't really see that it's productive at this point. But John Kerry has a tough job, and there does come a question, do these two sides truly want to coexist, or do they want to fight? And based on the media reports that I've seen, it seems now that they want to fight.
Nick, the last word?
Well, the reason that we can't get any kind of agreement on this issue is that the Israelis have been sabotaging a Palestinian unity government. They're afraid that allowing Palestinian elections won't produce the results that they want. Now, the Palestinians in this issue, I agree with you, Don. They're just treated as cannon fodder, unfortunately. It happens to be that more than 100 UN facilities have now been attacked by Israel. This latest bombing of a UN school, which killed 16, 17 people, that was even condemned by the White House, in fact. I mean, the simple fact here in the larger context is that the U.S. is the reason that Israel can pursue this kind of nihilistic policy of what is frankly apartheid and slow motion ethnic cleansing of Palestine over decades. And it's our $3 billion of military aid per year which facilitate what happens over there. You know, that's money which we shouldn't be sending over there. Israel's very isolated in the international community. In 2012, there was a UN vote to give Palestine non-member observer status. It was overwhelmingly approved, 138 to 9. We are in the vast minority on this issue in defending things from bombings of schools, from the assaults on neighborhoods, from the fact that our weapons are going towards murdering innocent Palestinians.
And can I jump in with one more comment? Sure. John, it's really an interesting dichotomy. We are using our Secretary of State to attempt to negotiate a peace, and yet this morning Politico reported that we are also about to, the United States and the Obama administration is about to send a new shipment of arms to Israel in the form of rockets, equipment, and bombs that they will use against Palestinians while we're negotiating a peace. There's something wrong with that. It needs to be rectified.
That's exactly right. It's in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was responsible for allowing the South African apartheid state to exist as long as it did. Nowadays, we find ourselves on the same side, the same wrong side of history in Israel.
Okay, before we move on, I'd like to remind our audience that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, and we'll answer as many as we can live on air toward the end of the program. Moving on, before the House left town today for a 5-week recess, Republicans voted to go forward with a lawsuit against President Obama for his use of executive orders, in this case delaying Obamacare's employer mandate. Democrats charge that this suit is simply a political stunt, and some have pointed out that it faults the president for not enforcing a law that Republicans oppose. So, Nick Morphus, does the lawsuit have merit? And politically speaking, is it a winner or a loser for Republicans?
There are a lot of things that the Obama administration has done, not just stopping at Obamacare, that has been unconstitutional. So I believe a lawsuit or an impeachment would have some merit and grounds to actually lay down. Politically speaking, it's suicide. Honestly, it is just going to come out looking as petty, which in some cases I'm sure some people in the House believe, some of the members of the House believe that this will be a great charge up for 2014, which I highly disagree. It is a political suicide move. We know how media headlines are drawn. We know how all these things are made up, and it'll be charged as an attack on the first black president, on his outreach, on his decisions. It's a stupid move. However, I would say that some of if they were to go forward with a lawsuit or there have been talks of impeachment, not on a massive level, but have been talks, I believe there would be some merit, but not for some things that Republicans would be willing to concede, such as our invasion of Libya, for instance, or the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki or his son. There are actual impeachable offenses I'd be willing to point out, not the ones that they bring up. So does it have merit? Yeah, it sort of does. Politically speaking, bad move.
Scott.
Well, I mean, this is just a bone they're trying to throw to the base. I don't think this is going to lead anywhere. I wouldn't call it political suicide because it's mainly just trying to rally the base. I mean, there has been pressure on Boehner that, oh, you got to follow impeachment. Well, that's even more political suicide because the media can even attack more on that. I think this is just. I mean, the House has voted several times to repeal Obamacare, and it's mainly just a way of just reminding the base that we're still opposing Obamacare. So I don't think this is really going to lead anywhere. It's just a way to rally up the base for the upcoming elections in November.
Also a good waste of taxpayer money.
Yeah, that as well.
Done.
Oh, there's so. I wish we could do it just an hour about this vote. My first question, much like they said, who's paying for this? Everyone watching the show tonight on publicsquare.net knows taxpayers are paying for it. This is an example of the federal overreach, the encroachment of federal power, the wasting of taxpayer dollars, and big government usurping the overwhelming rule and belief of the majority of the people that the current president of the United States, who's twice been elected, that he can carry out the powers of his office. And Wednesday night, instead of voting on immigration, helping those children at the border, instead of voting on job creation or equal pay for equal work, Republicans were taking part in this scheme to embarrass the president and rile up their base. And what this really means is that now the far right in the Republican Party is battling against the far, far, far right in the Republican Party. I personally believe this is the first step before the conversation that will take place in the fall, right before the elections, I hope, to impeach the president. And unlike what many Republican pundits have said all this week, there have been dozens of Republicans who've talked about impeachment, from Michelle Bachmann to a former governor of former part-time governor of Alaska, Jack Kingston, Kafitz from Utah. They've talked about impeachment. They have made public statements about impeachment, and this is the first step of two. And I would only hope that they save the impeachment vote until right before the election.
Nick?
Yeah, politically, this is foolish, in my opinion. It's clearly a stunt. I think all of us agree on that. But it's a symptom of the fact that our legislature is now held hostage by a minority within another minority branch of our government. And this is the balancing act which Boehner, I believe, has to pull in throwing these kinds of bones to the far right every now and then. Pragmatically, I actually agree. I think Obama should be impeached, but not for this. I don't think the grounds exist here. I think it is, the legal authority does exist to actually change the dates of Obamacare's implementation and the ends of the registration within the authority provided by the Act. But there are many other things that Nick referenced that I agree with that do merit impeachment, and it's things such as the totally unaccountable use of drones, for example.
I agree there.
It's things like the NDAA 2012, which allows the President of the United States, got pitifully low coverage in the media, by the way, allows the President of the United States to essentially suspend habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is the basis of Anglo-American law since the 13th century, since the signing of the Magna Carta, when British citizens, the peasants, petitioned the king for rights that if the king wanted to actually prosecute or try any of them, there would need to be some kind of trial, essentially. That the citizens, that peasants had rights. They had legal rights, and they could not be treated as non-entities. Now, the NDAA has completely undermined this. Under this authority, the executive branch, whether it's Obama, whoever comes after him, can legally disappear you, can legally kidnap you, put you in Guantanamo, put you in a CIA black site, without ever telling you of what the charges against you are, without ever filing charges, without informing anyone of where you are, without informing you of what the charges or where you're going, or giving any reason whatsoever. I mean, that is so far outside of the legal scope of what was supposed to be permissible, in my mind, under the Constitution, that I find it outrageous.
That seems to be a good transition point, because speaking of Bill Clinton, video emerged of the former president speaking on September 10th, 2001, just hours before the 9/11 attacks. He admitted that he had at least one chance to kill al-Qaeda head Osama bin Laden, but he opted not to, citing the likely civilian casualties. Now, Don Owens, obviously hindsight is 2020, but does Bill Clinton deserve some blame for not getting bin Laden when he had the chance?
Well, I think the easiest answer to this is this story, and I've read multiple accounts of it in LA Times, The Guardian, and in London, and in a Florida newspaper. This illustrates the tremendous, building on what Nick said earlier, the tremendous responsibility and power we put into the hand of the President of the United States. I think President Clinton, if you read the entire story, and his reluctance to order the strike, a missile strike, it wasn't a bunch of Marines landing on a helicopter, this would have been a missile fired from afar. I think it was a very reasonable and humane decision to make, because as you read the entire story, he said the possibility that existed is that they may not have hit bin Laden, and definitively they would have killed at least 300 people in Kandahar. And so I think it was a humane and reasonable decision by the president to say one man's possible killing was not worth at least 300 men, women, and children dying. Now, you could pose the opposite of that consideration with what we're doing with drones in the Middle East. We frequently and daily make decisions like this. Hey, there might be 3 al-Qaeda in this building. Let's fire a missile in that building. We kill 26 and get 2 of the al-Qaeda members. So I think President Clinton made the right decision. One last thing, this story also reminds me that when you think back to 9/11, because a lot of people in the comments on this story have said Bill Clinton should apologize because he could have killed him. I believe that today, as of August 1st, 2014, Richard Clarke remains the only public official who apologized to the American people for what happened on 9/11, both military failures, intelligence failures, and just general logistics. I think we need some version of South Africa's Truth Commissions, probably in many respects in Americans' life, but certainly on 9/11, a number of public officials in both parties need to apologize to the American people for the failures that happened before and leading up to 9/11.
Let's stick it here.
You're absolutely right. In fact, another thing that Richard Clarke says is that he stepped into the Oval Office and where they were planning the response to 9/11 on 9/12, day after, and he says they weren't talking about Osama bin Laden. They weren't talking about Afghanistan. They were talking about Iraq. And they said, how are we going to invade Iraq? And there's these famous memos, in fact, that Rumsfeld wrote that were released, that came out, that show him discussing, how are we going to make this about Iraq? How are we going to tie 9/11 to Iraq? And to this day, when you poll Americans, a quarter of Americans believe that Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11, and that the Bush administration never alleged that directly, but they very cleverly tied Saddam Hussein to 9/11 and to what happened on that day. I think this goes into the file of this story of unanswered questions on 9/11. There's a lot of people who don't want to think about this, but the simple fact is there's a lot of unanswered questions that surround that day. Senator Bob Graham was a very well-respected senator for a long time. He was on the Senate Intelligence Committee. He was a special advisor to the CIA, and he had ties to the congressional investigation on 9/11. Senator Bob Graham, Senator Bob Kerry, and also Representative Thomas Massie have all stated that Saudi Arabia was involved in 9/11. That there was state funding that went into 9/11. There's a 28-page classified report. But Graham and Kerry actually, this is Bob Kerry, Senator, also Senate Intelligence Committee, and also on the 9/11 congressional investigation, actually. So it was his job to know, They have come out publicly saying that we want the Obama administration to release these documents, which they are hiding, which the Bush administration was hiding. 28 pages of the congressional report on the investigation into 9/11, classified in full. It was an entire chapter based on Saudi involvement, classified in full. Thomas Massie came out just a couple weeks ago, gave a press conference on this, in which he was still very emotional. He said that the narrative which Americans have been led to believe about 9/11 is entirely wrong, and that there is a lot of other factors that we don't know about, and that we should.
The funny thing about that is, and I've been following that Massie story very closely, I'm a great admirer of Thomas Massie, is the fact that with this whole looking to place the blame of 9/11 on what whatever president we decide to place it on, whether it be Bush, whether it be Clinton, who knows who we decide to blame it on. What I would like to point out is the fact that we're so quick to blame it on a president, yet we don't want to ever acknowledge the actions of our foreign policy, which lead to these types of things that happen. I am a firm believer, I used to not be for the longest time, but I'm a firm believer when the CIA teaches about blowback. I wholeheartedly believe that our actions in the Middle East caused 9/11 to happen. For instance, our never-ending support for the Saudi government, which oppresses its own citizens, which Osama bin Laden was very, very clear in documenting exactly why he attacked the United States and why he continued to attack the United States, and why Al-Qaeda is an enemy of the United States. It has nothing to do with whether we are free, whether we're prosperous, whether we have women in the workplace or in Hollywood, or whatever reasons people try to dream up for the reasons why they attacked us. What we should be looking at is not who to place blame on, who didn't kill Osama bin Laden, when and where. We should be looking at, in retrospect, what our foreign policy does overseas, what it does to the people overseas, and how it inspires hatred. Because if we were to really think about this, and I was a big supporter of Ron Paul in 2008 and in 2012. He had an ad that went out in 2012 very specifically documenting exactly what we do overseas, but instead of making it us doing it overseas, they made it China doing it to us, and how we would react as people, and how China would try and depict us. And it's a very, very powerful ad, because it actually gets you, that was one of the very first ads that really got me to think about our foreign policy. And it's so incredible how we're always so willing to blame everyone else for whatever happens to us. Yes, I'm not here forgiving Al-Qaeda for bombing the World Trade Center. I mean, killing people is not something that should be glorified or praised or said is to be wonderful, but we gotta look at what actions that we take overseas that inspire this hatred, rather than just saying, oh, well, Bill Clinton didn't get Osama bin Laden, he's to blame for 9/11. Oh, well, Bush didn't get, he got word of 9/11 before it happened, we should blame him for it. What we should be doing is looking at our foreign policy, the actual root cause, rather than placing blame on who didn't do what where.
I mean, going into this would engage in alternative history. We don't know if that would have prevented 9/11. There might have been more terrorist attacks because we might have taken our eye off Al-Qaeda. We're like, we killed the leader, they're done. What we've actually learned throughout the last decade or so is that just Osama bin Laden is not Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is, there's militants linked to Al-Qaeda fighting in Somalia. There's militants linked to Al-Qaeda taking control of Iraq and parts of Syria. Osama bin Laden is dead, yet Al-Qaeda is still alive. So we don't know exactly what would have happened if we had killed Osama bin Laden. We might have had more terrorist attacks. Maybe the region would have been more unstable. We don't know what would have happened, and I think coming to conclusions saying, well, if he had killed Osama bin Laden, we wouldn't have 9/11 is just nonsense.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, to get back to what we're discussing as well about our own foreign policy. The United States has nearly 1,000 overseas bases, military bases. There are about 203 member countries in the UN. 130 of them have U.S. military bases. That's an empire, folks. I mean, it's really beyond reason to kind of to dismiss that.
Well, it's not fact, direct empire, because direct empire is frowned upon across the world. It's what I like to call a pseudo empire, where we have bases in all these different countries, and anyone who decides to move against American interests or not move in the direction of our interests will now feel the pressure of the United States. It's a pseudo empire. We have control over the region, or we have major influence in the region, but we don't outwardly own it.
Now we're at the point where 6 out of the 9 of the commissioners, the 9/11 Commission, say we did not get to the truth. So does the Chief Legal Counsel. It is consensus among people who are in a position to know that we didn't get to the truth about 9/11. I think I completely agree with you, Don. We need some kind of reinvestigation of this, and to be able to move past, because it's too important to just shrug and walk away.
Seems like a reoccurring
It's driven
theme.
13 years of policy.
Okay, finally, this week CIA Chief John Brennan apologized for hacking into Senate computers during an investigation into past torture abuses. This came just months after Brennan said of the charges, quote, "Nothing could be further from the truth." Now, Nick Brano, besides the fact that Brennan outright lied, what does this scandal mean for the separation of powers? Does the CIA need to be reined in? And if so, how would you do that?
I would.
I'm sorry.
I certainly think it does. I think this speaks to what in 1953 in his farewell address, President Eisenhower and former five-star general from World War II said, "We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry, and if unchecked, it could usurp power in the United States in the darkest of ways and affect every aspect of our life." I think this is precisely what he was warning about at the end of his career, about the CIA and the NSA and this intelligence apparatus that exists under the control, theoretically, of the executive branch. That was created by Truman in 1947. And I think that's precisely what Eisenhower was warning about when he was leaving. It was in 1961, when he was leaving office. Also, incidentally, it was President Truman himself who created the CIA, NSA. He said himself, he repented himself in a way in 1963 when he wrote an op-ed saying that the CIA has become a rogue policy-making wing of the government. Essentially, it was not under the control, it did not exist within the framework of checks and balances. Instead, it was driving policy on its own. That has never changed, frankly. You know, the fact that the CIA can spy and even blackmail members of Congress and their staff should be appalling, and it should really move us to hold what I think what we really need, which is a second church committee. In 1975, the church committee was commissioned in order to investigate tremendous amounts of abuses which had built up and public discontent with these agencies and the way that they had spied on the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the way that they had tracked them, the way that they had spied on congressmen. And it was created, the Senate Intelligence Committees were
And their work in
created
Cuba.
to actually rein them in. Now we're about 40 years from that point, and we've seen that the Senate Intelligence Committee, the House Intelligence Committee, has really become co-opted instead into this security state structure, and it's very ineffective.
I look at that committee as it's being left behind, not colluding, more as it's becoming ignorant or powerless to do anything to check it. I mean, you have issues, of course, lying about what the NSA is doing, lies now about what the CIA is doing. I mean, I've reached the point where anytime a member of the intelligence community comes out and says, and essentially effectively denies what the intelligence community has been accused of doing, I can't believe it anymore. And it's really sad, but you can't have any essential trust in America's supposed rightful institutions, especially the CIA. Its questionable actions throughout the past 5 or 6 decades certainly lead me to that conclusion, whether we're talking about its spying on the anti-war movement, blackmailing of Congress, or its actions in Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, different things of that nature. I believe it does need to be reined in.
I have no disagreements with anybody who said it definitely needs to be reined in. It's undermining our country, our democracy, our freedoms. I mean, what is this? What is all the spying coming to? It's only trying to preserve their own power. It's not actually trying to protect Americans or American interests. It seems like it's only protecting the CIA's interests. And that's what we kind of need to come to terms with, and that's what we're dealing with. I don't know if it can be reined in. That's the real question. We're all in agreement it needs to be reined in, but the real question is, can it be reined in?
How?
Yeah, that's like how.
It's, if you think about the depth and breadth of what we discussed here tonight, possibly invading the wrong country when the hijackers on the plane came from one country that is allegedly our ally. You talk about the CIA spying on federally elected officials sent to Washington, D.C. to be the representatives duly elected in their home districts and states, and the CIA spying on them. The people who are watching tonight, I think a larger question is, why are people more angry about this? The FBI can follow you to the library and demand that the library show them what books you have checked out. Why aren't Americans more angry about this? The Patriot Act, an incredibly far-reaching and anti-constitutional law that was passed into law, now seems like the little weaker brother of what's going on today. And Americans aren't angry about this. And if they are angry, it doesn't last very long. People need to find out more about this, know more about this, and demand accountability from their elected officials, especially the ones who are being spied on by the CIA, to change this, because that sound you hear isn't government oppression. What it is you losing control of your government. And so the people watching the show tonight demand accountability from their elected officials so that they can demand more accountability from groups like the CIA, because we don't vote for the CIA.
Something that
I
really...
can answer, hold on, just jump in.
Sure.
I can answer why the American public isn't angry. Our intelligence community has a great PR department. When you watch the media, when you turn on the TV, what do you see? You see like 24. You see Jack Bauer breaking all the rules, throwing out the Constitution, torturing people, and it's like, well, this guy breaking all the rules is the only thing protecting us from terrorists. You know, you see that in every show. NCIS, you see it in the Tom Clancy novels. You see all these type of like CIA agents, NSA agents. The only thing protecting us from terrorists is
more terrorism.
Yeah, these guys breaking the rules, and that's what is in the American mind.
All right, we're going to take a couple questions from our viewers, both center around the Middle East. The first of which is, why have the Palestinian territories remained the ghettos of the Middle East for decades? Don, you want to start?
I think I will touch a little bit on the comment I made earlier. If you look at the oil wealth alone in the Middle East and the alleged support the Palestinian cause has amongst other Middle East nations, that's a very good question. Why hasn't their infrastructure been built up? Why was there not more support for their airport, which has now unfortunately been bombed and mostly destroyed? It is because, to a large extent, the Palestinian people and their cause, in some respects by Hamas, in some respects by Middle East leadership as a whole, have used the Palestinians as a buffer and in some cases as puppets to fight on the front lines against Israel, but also keep them in that state. Again, there's a lot of work that could be done now by Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, to fly directly to Israel, broker a ceasefire, make it real, fight for real peace, but stop using the Palestinian people as puppets in this very real, very dangerous, and very deadly war. But I think it clearly is not a question of support or wealth, but it's also a question of actual support on the ground, actions versus simply words.
I have two words for that: Israeli embargo. I mean, that's the reason that Palestine is so impoverished, particularly
It's a
Gaza.
Middle Eastern embargo.
I mean, that's the reason. Everybody knows this. Even Israel, admits this. It's this embargo of goods and resources which has created essentially the largest open-air prison in the world, which is Gaza, that is prevented, which has absolutely impoverished Gaza. That's the reason.
I'm going to agree with Don. I don't know why Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Jordan aren't doing much more to all these Palestinian territories. I don't think it's our responsibility to make sure that these territories are non-impoverished. I mean, it's a tragedy, but it's ultimately not our problem, because if we make it our problem, we usually make the problem worse, as we can see in Iraq. So I think the best solution is to stay out and hope that the Middle Eastern countries, other Middle Eastern countries, come to the Palestinians' aid.
There's a Middle Eastern country right now building an entire city that is air conditioned and indoors.
Is that the UAE?
Yes, in the I couldn't think of the name, United Arab Emirates. And there are people in Gaza who are being bombed, and they profess support for the cause, but they're not doing anything. Yeah. Look, I just think at the end of the day, there are some Middle Eastern countries, Arab countries, it benefits them to have Palestinians there on the front line, because if the Palestinians create peace with Israel, then who else do they have to beef with, is the best word I can come up with.
Well,
and it's unfortunate.
Our second question on the subject: how is it possible to talk about Hamas while ignoring Iran, which sponsors Hamas?
Well, actually, Iran no longer sponsors Hamas because of the Syrian civil war. There's actually been a split between Sunni and Shiite extremists because of the Syrian civil war. They cut off funding soon after that, so we can't place the blame of Hamas's actions on Iran or the Assad regime or even Hezbollah, because they're actually fighting with his Sunni extremists in Syria and Iraq right now. So placing the blame of Hamas on Iran or any other state actor is nonsense. Iran's no longer sponsoring Hamas, and Hamas is not taking orders from Iran.
The most underreported story of the week. I am going to go ahead and pick someone to start. Scott?
I think this story coming out of this is that the right and left have a lot more to agree on than how the media portrays it or even our political parties represent. I think when it comes to surveillance, when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to a whole host of other issues, I think there's a lot of things that could bridge the right and the left.
I agree.
If I could go next.
Sure.
I agree with you. And that's why I think that one framework with which to view kind of political factions in society is not right and left. I think it's a false dichotomy largely.
I agree.
What really, the really instructive one is institutional versus non-institutional. Is, this large concentration, corporate capital, and private interests that penetrates government versus simply the public interest. But my story was related to this and related to Bill Clinton too. And it gets to the jobs reports, which came out, I believe it was today or recently.
This morning.
And it was kind of prognosticating a better future, kind of leading us to believe that perhaps we've overcome this recession. But we're never going to overcome the recession and this boom and bust cycle of our economy until we address the underlying factors. What we saw during the Great Recession was only a symptom of the true problem, and that's the fact that, speaking about Clinton, he deregulated banks in 1994, and in 1999 he allowed a merger of commercial and investment banking, and he also deregulated interstate banking. Today, the banks are 30% larger, the major banks, the Big Four, than they were before the financial crisis.
And they're people now.
Right, and they have more persons' rights, they have more personhood. Right. So the systemic problem at the foundation of the financial crash hasn't gone away. In fact, it's worse. And until we deal with that, we're going to be stuck in this cycle of boom and bust. And we shouldn't be surprised about it.
Most underreported story, I've been following a lot of this news of civil asset forfeiture, and I was very happy to see Senator Rand Paul put forward a bill in the Senate to address this issue. And for those who don't know, civil asset forfeiture is this notion that the police can seize property of yours if they so call, without even telling you of suspecting you of a crime. They pull you over and they find you, say, with a large amount of cash. If they assume that was for drug purposes, which they don't have to prove, they can seize those assets and, of course, keep them. They call it, quote, policing for profit. And I was very happy to see Senator Rand Paul put forward a bill to address this issue.
Don, your underreported story of the week?
Oh, there's so many things I wanted to talk about this week. Florida congressman mistaken two government officials for Indian nationals, and after being told that they were actually U.S. citizens, he still spoke to them like they were Indian nationals. I thought about talking about Jay Carney. I being a PR person, leaving the White House, going on late night shows, and how difficult it is doing PR. I thought about talking about the economy, 200,000 jobs, but instead I want to talk about the most underreported story of the week, the Koch brothers. Al Jazeera did a Freedom of Information Act request and found out that the Koch brothers' father was investigated by the FBI during the Eisenhower administration based off of one statement he made about Eisenhower. And the statement was that the Koch brothers' fathers thought that Eisenhower was a secret communist. And then, of course, during the Eisenhower years, there was a big
McCarthyism was during the Eisenhower
fomenting
years.
of an environment of anti-communism. So it makes you wonder, all these many decades later, how influenced the Koch brothers were because of the FBI targeting their father, and how that has influenced their public positions today, not just as libertarians, but how they spend their money. And the irony that a news organization like Al Jazeera, which probably couldn't have existed in America during the Eisenhower administration, found this out. My most underreported story of the week.
All right, that's going to do it for this week, the long edition. We apologize for the extended version, but thanks for watching The Square Circle, and we'll see you again next week.